Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Mr. Rader here. Economics, quality of life, and we're going to be examining today is a concept in economics known as the production possibilities frontier or the PPF curve. And what we're going to try to figure out is balance, right? So, if we think about our essential question for the unit, how do our individual choices allow us to best manage scarce resources? This is a question that all governmental systems have to kind of consider in terms of how they allocate their budgets. So, for the opening question, I'd like you to write a response in the Google Doc, and I want you to think about it in a binary sense. Military expenditures and education expenditures. And I want you to tell me which one you think should have more investment. Should the government be spending more money as a percentage of the overall budget for the military or for the education system? Okay, now this is what the one of the more recent budgets look like under President Donald J. Trump in 2019. The budget for a discretionary budget was $1.19 trillion. Now, there's two budgets. There's a mandatory budget and there's discretionary. Discretionary budget are the line items in a budget that are not legally mandated by law. So, for example, Social Security is a legally mandated provision under U.S. law, whereas investments in transportation, as you see here at 2%, is not. So, in part of his request was a $727 billion allocation, or 61% of the budget for the U.S. military. And education on this particular budget was 5% of the budget, so the same amount as healthcare, government expenditures, so on and so forth. Okay, so now this reflects a certain set of priorities and values, and that's important when we think about any kind of a budget. And again, notice these numbers. Now, I want you to compare it with the budget that was proposed in 2016 under the Obama administration, under President Obama. Now, you'll notice that the military budget is still the largest. It's 54%. It's the largest by far. So, whether we have a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House, the military is always going to be a very large part of the overall federal budget. But notice in this particular context that it's 54%, right? And under the Trump request, see if it'll let me go back, it was 61%. Education 5%, education 6%, right? Different ways to kind of consider where governments want the money to go, right? So they have to make choices. Like, what do we give up in terms of the opportunity costs if we invest in one thing as opposed to something else? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to use that information to help you think through this passage. They explain in the passage what the PPF curve looks like. And what you're going to notice, there's multiple points on this curve. And you're going to be able to explain in your Google Doc what is actually happening at each point on the PPF curve and thinking about how opportunity costs are embedded in this curve. And I'm going to ask you in the second question, if you were the leader of the executive branch as the president, what point on the curve would you actually try to allocate your budget and why? Like, what would be your rationale? So this is the PPC, or the production possibilities curve, the frontier curve. So you'll notice on the x-axis is quantity of butter being produced. Now, they're not literally talking about butter, and on the y-axis guns. But for this analogy, an easy way to think about it is guns would represent military expenditures, and butter would be all of the forms of soft power. So this could be things like education, food, nutrition programs, schools, the police department, the fire department, the city sanitation department, right? So basically, what you need to do is explain what's happening at point A, what's happening at point X, B, D, and C. So I'm going to give you one answer so that you can already pre-fill it in, and we're going to look at X. Now, X is outside of the PPF curve, and basically it's a point that's unattainable. You can't get to X unless you get more resources. So basically, when you look at X, this would be the potential needs and wants. And if a country gets access to more resources, a new PPF curve would be drawn, and you would have a new point X. I'll also give you point D. Point D is essentially in the middle. So it's what we call in economics maximum efficiency, that there's a balance between the kinds of goods that are being produced. All right, once you finish looking through this, I'd like you to read in response to this quote from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was our president from 1952 to 1960. So he really comes to power right in the middle of the Korean War, and he's in power until 1960. Now, at the time, the United States begins really investing heavily into its military, and he actually speaks about this in a speech about the military industrial complex when he leaves office in 1960. This actually comes 7 years before that. It's from a speech, Chance for Peace, and he says, "The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is two electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000. It is two fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer